It was supposed to be a normal night. A packed venue. A roaring crowd. The kind of electricity Queen could summon with a single chord. Freddie Mercury walked onto the stage like a man carved out of confidence, sharp, brilliant, untouchable. The audience was already screaming before he even opened his mouth. But what no one in that crowd knew, what not even most of the crew understood in real time, was that Freddie was about to spend the next hour fighting something far more terrifying than a bad note or a technical failure. He was fighting his own body. Because somewhere in the chaos of performance, under the heat of the lights, the rush of movement, the sharp edges of equipment, Freddie got hurt. Not a small scrape. Not a forgettable bruise. He started bleeding. And instead of stopping, he hid it. He turned pain into choreography. He turned panic into showmanship. He smiled wider, moved bigger, joked louder, while the blood quietly spread where no one could see. Why didn't he stop? Who noticed first? And what was the one moment that almost exposed everything to the entire arena? Stay with this story. And if you love raw, cinematic Queen moments like this, subscribe now, because the nights that didn't make headlines are the ones that reveal who Freddie really was. The stage was alive beneath Freddie's boots. Not just lit, alive. Heat rose from the floor in waves, mixed with smoke, sweat, and that metallic scent that only exists where cables and amps and thousands of voices collide. Freddie moved like he belonged to the noise, like the crowd's breath was his fuel. Every gesture was sharp, deliberate, an invitation to worship. He was halfway through a song when it happened. Not with a dramatic crash. Not with a scream. With a tiny, almost invisible mistake. Freddie took one step back, fast, instinctive, spinning toward the microphone stand with that effortless swagger people mistook for ease. But the stage was crowded with the hidden machinery of a live show, cables, a monitor edge, a metal corner that shouldn't have been where it was. His foot clipped. His body adjusted instantly. Freddie was too experienced to fall. He caught himself with a quick shift of balance that looked like choreography to the audience. But his forearm struck something hard. A sharp, unforgiving impact. Pain flashed bright and immediate, like a match struck in darkness. Freddie's breath hitched for half a second, just long enough for his eyes to narrow. He kept singing. Because stopping, even for a fraction, would break the spell. He glanced down quickly, subtle, almost secretive. Under the stage lights, he saw it, a dark smear beginning to form where skin had split. At first it looked like sweat, like shadow. Then it grew. Blood. Warm and unmistakably real, sliding down his arm in a thin line. Freddie's stomach tightened, not from the injury, but from the danger of it. Blood wasn't just pain. Blood was evidence. Blood was vulnerability made visible. The crowd kept roaring, unaware. Brian May was on the other side of the stage, lost in the song, curls bouncing as he played. Roger's drums thundered like a heartbeat. John's bass held everything steady, anchoring the entire performance like a spine. Freddie had one thought, sharp and immediate. No one sees this. He shifted his grip on the microphone, turning the injured arm slightly away from the crowd. He moved closer to the stand as if it were a creative choice, letting it block certain angles. He exaggerated gestures with his other hand, giving the audience what they wanted while quietly hiding what he couldn't afford to show. The pain pulsed again, deeper now, more insistent. Every time he moved, the cut pulled open slightly, releasing more blood. He could feel it running under the fabric near his wrist, sticky and hot. Freddie smiled wider. That was the terrifying part. His body was screaming, and his face was performing joy. He leaned into the crowd, throwing his head back, laughing into the microphone like nothing was wrong. The audience responded instantly, screaming louder, feeding him energy that almost drowned the pain. Almost. A spotlight swept across him, bright and unforgiving. The light caught the red sheen for a brief second, and Freddie's heart jumped, an instant of panic. But the angle changed. The moment passed. Freddie breathed again. He knew he needed a solution fast. Not later. Not after the show. Now. Because if blood started dripping onto the stage floor, someone would notice. A camera would catch it. A crew member would see it. The audience would sense something was wrong. And once the crowd senses weakness, the story changes. Freddie moved toward Brian during a guitar phrase, smiling as if sharing the spotlight. Under the music, without moving his lips much, he murmured. "Don't look at my arm." Brian's fingers never stopped playing, but his eyes flicked, confused. "What?" Brian mouthed. Freddie kept smiling. "Just, don't." Brian's gaze dropped anyway for a fraction, catching the red stain. His expression tightened instantly, concern slicing through performance. Freddie shook his head slightly, a warning. "Not now." Brian understood. He shifted closer, not enough to alarm the crowd, just enough to position his body between Freddie and the most direct camera angles. A guitarist's instinct: cover, support, protect. Roger noticed the proximity and frowned. John glanced up, reading body language like he always did. Freddie kept singing. The injury throbbed. The blood kept moving. His mind raced through possibilities: towel, tape, a quick bandage. But leaving the stage would raise questions. So Freddie made another decision, one that revealed exactly who he was under pressure. He would finish the song. Then, during the next transition, he would vanish for seconds, just seconds, fix it without anyone realizing. He leaned into the mic, voice steady, eyes bright, and gave the crowd a playful command. "Sing!" The audience erupted, taking over the chorus, thousands of voices rising as one. Freddie raised his healthy arm, conducting them like a choir, buying himself time. And as the crowd sang his words for him, Freddie Mercury turned slightly into the shadows at stage right, still smiling, still moving, while the blood on his arm quietly spread like a secret he refused to let the world touch. The crowd was singing for him now. Thousands of voices, loud and proud, filling the arena with the kind of sound that could hide almost anything. Freddie had planned it that way. He lifted his arm, conducting them like a maestro, smiling as if this was generosity, Freddie giving the spotlight to his people. But inside his head, everything was racing. He took 2 quick steps toward stage right, just far enough to slip into the half-darkness where the lights didn't linger. The music thundered on without him for a moment. Brian extended a guitar phrase longer than usual, instinctively covering the gap. Roger hit the drums harder, louder, keeping the energy from dipping. Freddie pressed his injured arm against his side and finally looked down properly. The cut was worse than he'd hoped. Blood had soaked into the edge of his sleeve, darkening the fabric. His skin felt hot and tight, every movement pulling at the wound. He sucked in a sharp breath through his teeth, the pain finally demanding attention. "Bloody hell," he muttered. A stagehand noticed him hovering near the shadows and rushed over, eyes wide. "Freddie, are you okay?" Freddie didn't hesitate. Hesitation was how secrets died. "Shoo," he said softly, still smiling, still half-facing the crowd. "I've cut myself. I need something. Now." Quietly. The stagehand followed Freddie's gaze to the sea of faces, then back to the arm. Panic flickered across his expression. "We should stop." "No," Freddie said instantly. Not angry. Final. "You'll get me a towel. Dark. And tape. Anything that sticks." The man hesitated for half a second too long. Freddie leaned closer, eyes sharp now, the smile gone for just an instant. "If you stop this show, you'll never forgive yourself. And neither will I." That did it. The stagehand vanished. Freddie leaned against a speaker stack, heart pounding harder than the drums. He could feel the blood continuing to run, slow but persistent. His throat felt dry. The heat from the lights made everything worse. He peeked back toward center stage. Brian was still playing, body angled just enough to block certain sightlines. Roger was watching Freddie between hits, jaw tight. John stayed planted near the back, eyes tracking movement like a silent guardian. They knew something was wrong. They just didn't know how bad. The towel arrived fast, too white. Freddie grimaced. No. Darker. The stagehand ripped off his own black scarf and handed it over with shaking hands. That'll do, Freddie said. He wrapped the scarf tightly around his arm, biting back a hiss as the pressure made stars flash behind his eyes. Blood soaked through almost immediately. Tape, Freddie snapped. The stagehand produced a roll, fumbling with it. Freddie took it himself, winding it around the scarf with quick, practiced motions. His fingers were steady now, not because the pain had faded, but because adrenaline had taken over completely. The crowd roared again, sensing something unscripted, something electric. Freddie lifted his head and laughed into the microphone, even as the band carried the sound. "You're singing beautifully tonight," he shouted. The audience went wild. They had no idea he was holding himself together with borrowed fabric and tape. Brian drifted closer under the guise of movement. "Is it bad?" he asked under the music. Freddie didn't look at him. "Define bad." Brian caught a glimpse of the scarf, the tape, the red seeping through. His face paled slightly. "You need stitches," Brian said. Freddie smiled. "After." Roger shouted from behind the kit, "What's happening?" Freddie shot him a look that said later. Roger understood. The band adjusted without discussion, shorter gaps, tighter transitions, fewer moments where Freddie had to hold still. They covered him the way only musicians who trusted each other completely could. But the pain was catching up. Every time Freddie raised his arm, it pulled. Every time he spun, the tape tugged. The scarf was already damp, heavy with blood. He could feel it cooling now, sticky and uncomfortable. Still, he refused to slow down. Because slowing down would mean thinking. And thinking would mean fear. At one point, a camera swung closer than expected. Freddie reacted instantly, spinning away, turning the move into a dramatic flourish. The crowd screamed, delighted. Behind the smile, Freddie's heart slammed. Too close. He began favoring one side of the stage, subconsciously mapping safe angles, shadows, places where he could breathe for half a second without being seen too clearly. Mary watched from the side, her face tightening as she noticed the odd movements, the stiffness, the way Freddie kept one arm close to his body. She leaned toward a crew member. "Is he hurt?" The crew member hesitated. Freddie caught the exchange from the corner of his eye. He shook his head slightly at the crewman. "Not yet." The song ended in a thunderous finish. Freddie raised both arms instinctively, then stopped halfway, pain exploding through him. He turned it into a bow instead, theatrical, exaggerated. The audience roared. Freddie straightened, chest heaving, sweat dripping down his temple. He had bought himself time. But he knew something now that he hadn't when the night began. This injury wasn't a small inconvenience. It was a countdown. And if he wasn't careful, the show would expose him before he could expose himself. The danger wasn't the pain anymore. Pain, Freddie could manage. What terrified him now was visibility. The scarf around his arm was heavier, darker, soaked through in places he could feel but didn't dare look at again. Each movement pulled at the wound, and with every pull came a warm reminder that the fix was temporary at best. Freddie adjusted his posture instinctively, keeping his injured arm close to his body, fingers curled slightly as if holding himself together. He moved less wildly now, not enough for the audience to notice, but enough that Brian noticed immediately. Brian caught Freddie's eye across the stage. Freddie gave him a look that said keep playing. The band launched into the next song, faster, louder. Freddie used motion as camouflage, pacing the stage in long strides rather than spins. He stayed closer to the microphone stand, using it as a shield. He leaned into the crowd again, pulling their voices forward whenever he felt the pressure build in his arm. And then, it happened. A sharp tug. The tape shifted. Freddie felt it instantly, the horrible, unmistakable sensation of fabric loosening against skin. His stomach dropped. He glanced down, quick and precise. A thin red line had escaped the wrap and was sliding toward his wrist. If it reached his hand, it would drip. And if it dripped, someone would see. Freddie's breath caught for a fraction of a second. He forced himself not to react. The crowd was screaming, hands in the air, faces lit with joy. The irony struck him hard, thousands of people celebrating, while he stood there trying to stop his own blood from hitting the floor. He moved. Not fast. Not frantic. Purposeful. He crossed the stage toward Brian, placing himself closer to the guitar amps where shadows pooled thicker. He leaned against the stand casually, resting his arm in a way that looked like swagger but pressed the cloth tighter. Brian leaned in again, voice low. "Freddie." "I know," Freddie whispered back, not looking at him. "Just, play." Brian nodded once. He stepped forward into the light, pulling attention toward himself, stretching a solo longer than planned. The crowd erupted, eyes turning away from Freddie just when he needed them to. Roger caught on instantly. He hit the drums harder, louder, building tension, demanding focus. John's bass locked in, grounding everything, giving Freddie space. Freddie used the distraction to slip a hand inside the loose edge of the scarf, pressing down hard. Pain flared, sharp and white, but the bleeding slowed, just enough. He smiled again, wide and brilliant, lifting his chin as if nothing in the world could touch him. But his vision blurred slightly. Not from blood loss, not yet, but from the strain of holding everything together. His shoulder ached. His arm burned. His heartbeat felt too loud inside his chest. Mary watched from the wings, eyes narrowed now. She saw the stiffness, the way Freddie avoided certain movements, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes anymore. She stepped toward the stage manager. "Something's wrong," she said quietly. The stage manager hesitated. "He didn't say." Mary cut him off. "Freddie never says." Back on stage, Freddie reached the edge of the platform, crouching slightly to interact with the front row. Fans reached out, desperate to touch him. Hands brushed his boots, his leg. One hand reached for his arm. Freddie recoiled instinctively. The movement was small, but noticeable. The fan froze, confused. Freddie recovered instantly, laughing, blowing a kiss instead, redirecting the moment. The crowd cheered, but Freddie's pulse spiked. Too close. He stood quickly, the sudden motion pulling at the wound again. A new wave of warmth seeped through the cloth. He felt it then, one single drop breaking free. It fell. Not to the stage. It landed on his boot. Freddie's stomach twisted. If it had fallen just a few inches further, the spotlight would have caught it. Someone would have seen it. A camera would have zoomed in. The illusion would have shattered in real time. Freddie straightened slowly, forcing control into every muscle. This was no longer about finishing strong. This was about finishing without exposure. He leaned into the microphone, voice steady despite everything. "You're incredible tonight," he told the crowd. They roared back at him, giving him energy he barely felt. Inside, something shifted. Freddie realized he was walking a line far thinner than he'd ever walked before, not just between pain and performance, but between myth and reality. If the myth cracked tonight, it wouldn't just be blood on the stage. It would be Freddie Mercury, unmasked, in front of everyone. And for the first time that night, a dangerous thought crossed his mind. What if I can't hide it much longer? Brian realized it wasn't just an accident anymore. It was the way Freddie was moving. Not the theatrical strut, not the deliberate swagger he used to dominate a crowd, but something tighter, controlled, as if every step was calculated to avoid pulling at something that hurt. Freddie wasn't improvising for flair. He was improvising to survive. Brian watched him closely as the next song began. He noticed how Freddie kept turning his injured side away from the lights, how his gestures favored one arm, how he stopped leaning on the microphone stand the way he always did. These were not artistic choices. These were precautions. Brian stepped closer to Roger during a drum fill, leaning in just enough to be heard. "He's bleeding," he said. Roger's sticks kept moving, but his eyes widened. "How bad?" Brian shook his head slightly. "Bad enough." Roger glanced toward Freddie, catching a glimpse of the dark wrap around his arm. The scarf was soaked now, no longer hiding anything from someone who knew what to look for. John noticed next, not because of the blood, but because of the space Freddie was creating around himself. John had always read absence better than presence. And Freddie was carefully avoiding contact. John moved closer to Brian. "He's in trouble," he said quietly. The three of them exchanged a look that didn't need words. This wasn't about finishing a set perfectly anymore. This was about protecting Freddie. Roger adjusted the tempo slightly, nothing obvious, just enough to reduce the physical demand. Brian extended instrumental sections again, stepping forward into the spotlight, giving Freddie a moment to stand still without it looking strange. Freddie noticed immediately. He shot Brian a look, half gratitude, half warning. "Don't let them know." Brian ignored the warning. Between songs, Brian moved closer, speaking under his breath while the crowd cheered. "Freddie, you need to stop." Freddie smiled into the microphone, waving at the audience. "I'm having the time of my life." Brian's voice hardened. "This isn't funny." Freddie turned just enough so Brian could see his eyes, sharp, defiant, exhausted. "If I stop now," Freddie said quietly, "they'll remember the blood, not the music." Roger joined them, stick still in hand. "You're risking infection. Shock. God knows what." Freddie laughed softly, dismissive. "Darling, I've survived worse than a scratch." John stepped in then, calm but firm. "This isn't a scratch." Freddie opened his mouth to argue, and stopped. Because he felt it then. A sudden wave of dizziness, subtle but undeniable. His balance wavered just enough that Brian reached out instinctively, steadying him for half a second before pulling back so the crowd wouldn't notice. Freddie straightened quickly, heart pounding. That scared him. More than the blood. More than the pain. Because dizziness meant limits. And Freddie had built his entire identity on pretending limits didn't apply to him. Roger leaned in close. "If you pass out up here, it won't be your choice anymore." Freddie swallowed hard. The crowd was chanting now, demanding the next song, hungry and unaware. Freddie looked out at them, thousands of faces lit with devotion. They didn't see the scarf soaked dark red. They didn't see the tension in his shoulders. They didn't hear the strain in his breath between lines. They saw Freddie Mercury. Untouchable. He looked back at the band. At Brian, whose worry was written all over his face. At Roger, angry because he was afraid. At John, steady, watching Freddie like an anchor. And for the first time that night, Freddie felt something crack that had nothing to do with skin. 5 more songs, Freddie said quietly. Not asking. Brian shook his head. 2. Freddie bristled. I decide. Roger snapped back, not if you drop. The argument lasted only seconds, hidden behind smiles and applause. Finally, John spoke again, low and controlled. We finished the set. No encore. That's the deal. Freddie hesitated. No encore meant denying the crowd. It meant breaking tradition. It meant admitting, if only to the band, that something was wrong. But it also meant control. Freddie nodded once. "Fine," he said. "But we finish strong." They returned to their positions. The band tightened around him, not physically, but musically. They watched him constantly now, ready to adjust, ready to step in. Freddie lifted the microphone again, adrenaline pushing back the dizziness, pain roaring but contained. The show continued. But it was no longer just Freddie carrying it. Now, the band was carrying Freddie. And that realization, humbling, terrifying, strangely comforting, changed the night forever. Freddie felt the song coming before it arrived. It sat in his chest like a warning, heavy and unavoidable. He knew this one demanded more than presence. It demanded control, breath, strength, things his body was quietly running out of. As the opening notes began, Freddie closed his eyes for half a second longer than usual. Just get through this. The lights shifted, bathing the stage in white and gold. The crowd erupted again, unaware that this song, this exact moment, was the most dangerous of the night. Freddie stepped forward, lifting the microphone with his good arm. His injured arm throbbed now, not sharp pain anymore, but a deep, pulsing ache that radiated into his shoulder. The scarf beneath the tape felt soaked, heavy, clinging to his skin like a reminder he couldn't escape. He began to sing. The first line came out steady. Controlled. The crowd leaned in, captivated. Freddie paced himself carefully, shortening breaths, letting the band carry transitions. Brian stayed close, stretching guitar phrases when Freddie needed air. Roger softened the attack of the drums, just slightly. John's bass was steady, grounding Freddie like a spine holding a fragile body upright. But halfway through the song, the dizziness returned. Not sudden, creeping. The stage lights blurred at the edges. The roar of the crowd began to feel distant, like he was underwater. Freddie planted his feet wider, instinctively lowering his center of gravity so he wouldn't sway. He felt another tug at his arm. The wound burned again, fresh pain slicing through the haze. Freddie's breath caught mid-phrase. The note wavered. For the first time that night, the crack wasn't subtle. A ripple moved through the front rows, not panic, but curiosity. Something sounded different. Something felt off. Brian's head snapped toward Freddie. Roger's sticks faltered for half a beat. Freddie recovered fast, leaning into the microphone stand, turning the moment into a growl, a rasp that sounded intentional, raw, rock and roll, dangerous. The crowd roared, thrilled by what they thought was edge. But Freddie knew. He was running on fumes. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. Sweat dripped down his spine, mixing with the cold stickiness of blood beneath his sleeve. His legs felt heavy, like they belonged to someone else. Then came the hardest part. The long phrase. The one that required breath, power, and balance. Freddie stared out at the crowd, thousands of faces, lights flashing like stars. For a split second, fear pierced through the performance. If I push this, I might fall. He glanced back at the band. Brian met his eyes instantly, reading the hesitation. Brian shook his head, just once. A silent warning. Roger's gaze was locked on him now, jaw tight. John didn't move, but his eyes were sharp, ready. Freddie made a choice. He didn't push. Instead, he altered the phrasing mid-line, turning toward the audience and lifting the microphone outward, letting their voices flood in where his strength couldn't. Sing it, he shouted, voice rough but commanding. The crowd exploded. Thousands of voices rose, carrying the melody like a wave. Freddie stood there, chest heaving, letting the sound wash over him while he caught his breath. From the outside, it looked brilliant. From the inside, it was survival. Freddie smiled, smaller now, tired, and nodded in appreciation, playing the role perfectly. He moved again, slower, measured, every step deliberate. As the song reached its end, Freddie felt his knees weaken. Just slightly. Enough that Brian stepped closer, positioning himself near Freddie's side under the guise of showmanship. If Freddie went down, Brian would catch him. Freddie noticed, and hated how grateful he felt. The final chord hit. The crowd erupted. Freddie raised his arm instinctively, then stopped, pain flaring bright. He clenched his jaw, forcing a bow instead, dramatic and deep. The movement sent another sharp pulse through his arm, and for a terrifying second, his vision went dark at the edges. He straightened slowly. Still standing. Barely. The applause thundered, deafening, endless. Freddie smiled at the audience, wide enough to convince them. But when he turned away, toward the shadows of the stage, his face collapsed. No cameras there. No lights. Just the truth. Roger leaned toward him, voice urgent. That was it. No more. Freddie didn't argue. He didn't have the strength. He nodded once, exhausted, adrenaline finally losing the fight. As the band moved into the final song of the night, simpler, safer, Freddie stayed closer to them than ever before. He sang less. Conducted more. Let them carry him. And as the show barreled toward its end, Freddie realized something quietly devastating. He wasn't afraid of the crowd seeing him bleed. He was afraid of the moment when his body would finally force him to stop pretending he was invincible. The moment the lights went out, Freddie's body gave up pretending. The roar of the crowd faded behind the curtain, replaced by the dull echo of footsteps, equipment being moved, voices shouting cues. Adrenaline drained from his veins all at once, leaving exhaustion and pain behind like a bill that had finally come due. Freddie took 2 steps backstage. And stopped. His knees buckled, not enough to collapse, but enough that Brian was instantly at his side, gripping his shoulder. Easy, Brian said quietly. Freddie exhaled hard, nodding once. His arm throbbed violently now, the pain sharp and constant. The scarf was completely soaked. Blood had seeped through the tape, dark and unmistakable. Roger came up fast, eyes wide. Jesus, Freddie. John followed, calm but pale. You're losing more blood than you think. Freddie waved them off weakly. I'm standing, aren't I? But his voice was hoarse. Thin. Tired. Mary pushed through the cluster of crew members, her face tightening when she saw his arm. Freddie. That was all she said. But it was enough. Freddie's bravado cracked. They guided him into the dressing room and closed the door behind them, shutting out the noise, the celebration, the illusion. The room smelled like sweat, metal, and antiseptic as someone finally brought a proper first aid kit. Freddie sank onto the chair, shoulders slumping for the first time all night. When the tape was cut away, the reality of the injury was exposed, angry, split skin, deeper than it should have been. Roger swore under his breath. Brian ran a hand through his hair. Why didn't you stop? Freddie didn't answer immediately. He stared at the floor, breathing slowly as the wound was cleaned. It hurt now in a way he couldn't hide. His jaw clenched, and a quiet hiss escaped his lips before he could stop it. I didn't want them to see me fail, Freddie said finally. The room went quiet. Roger's frustration softened into something closer to fear. You didn't fail. You scared the hell out of us. Freddie looked up then, really looked at them. At Brian's worried eyes. At Roger's clenched jaw. At John's steady presence. At Mary, standing just behind them, arms folded tight like she was holding herself together. I know, Freddie said softly. That's the problem. Brian crouched slightly in front of him. What are you talking about? Freddie swallowed. His throat burned, raw and dry. All my life, he said slowly, choosing the words carefully, I've been afraid of the moment when I can't carry it alone anymore. No jokes. No flair. Just truth. Roger shook his head. That's not weakness. Freddie gave a small, tired smile. It feels like it. Mary stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. You don't get extra points for bleeding in silence. That hit him. Freddie laughed softly, then winced as the movement tugged at his arm. I suppose not. The medic finished bandaging him properly now, wrapping the wound cleanly, securely. Freddie watched the process with unusual stillness, like someone finally allowing care instead of resisting it. John spoke quietly. You don't have to prove anything to us. Freddie nodded. I know. But knowing and believing were different things. He leaned back in the chair, suddenly exhausted beyond words. The adrenaline was gone. The show was over. The mask had nowhere left to hide. I didn't want the night to be about me being hurt, Freddie admitted. I wanted it to be about the music. Brian's voice softened. It still was. Freddie closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in slowly. Then he opened them and said something none of them expected. Next time, Freddie said, voice barely above a whisper, I'll tell you. Silence. Then Roger nodded. Good. Brian smiled faintly. That's all we wanted. Mary exhaled, relief flickering across her face. Freddie stood carefully, testing his balance. He was weaker now, but strangely lighter. The burden of pretending had lifted, just a little. As they prepared to leave the room, Freddie paused at the door and glanced back at the mirror. He barely recognized the man staring back at him, tired, pale, bandaged. But alive. Still standing. Still Freddie Mercury. He turned back to the band and smiled, not the performance smile, not the armor. The real one. Let's go home, he said. And for once, that was enough.